On this episode of China Unscripted, China could invade Taiwan sooner than you think. Japan is key to defending Taiwan, but only if the U.S. gets its act together. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnazda.
Joining us today is Dr. Robert D. Eldridge. Dr. Eldridge is an expert on Japan security and diplomacy. He's a senior researcher for the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies in Tokyo. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. It's great to see you all again.
Yeah. I mean, even since the last time we talked, there's been some big changes in Japan. It's amazing to see how quickly I guess it hasn't been quickly, but the shift from like the, very staunch support for the pacifist kind of constitution Japan has. And now we're seeing really some big strides towards militarization, specifically geared towards China. How is this being received?
In general, among the Japanese public, this has been, a long time coming. The Japanese public, I think, in many ways, is ahead of the Japanese politicians in their thinking. Whether it's on Taiwan-related issues or the threat that China poses to Japan and the region, or the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance. In general, the public is well ahead of the politicians. It's the politicians who've been slow to really update the alliance and update Japan's national security policies.
So what was it that made the change for the Japanese population, and why have the politicians been slow to react?
Yeah, well, politicians, they have a lot of different reasons for, being cautious on China. As you know, many politicians, not only in Japan, but in other countries, the U.S. as well, have done quite a lot of business with China. And so they're reluctant to anger China. So in some cases, those politicians here in Japan have been really slow to address those matters. Also, within Japan, there's a coalition government. It's a two-party government, the Liberal Democratic Party being the largest, but a smaller party that has historically been pro-China and close to China, called Komeito, or Clean Government Party. Being in the coalition, they've acted as a brake, like a foot brake on the Japanese government from pursuing a more robust security policy vis-a-vis China, or with regard to possibly amending or changing the post-war constitution. As far as the general public goes, again, I go back to my earlier comment that the public in general has been much more realistic in understanding the international challenges and the regional threats. If there was a shift in public opinion, I think it was the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who really helped facilitate the modernization of the Japanese public thinking about Japan's role in the world and its need to contribute more to international security, as well as to deal with the threat that China is. So you can kind of, I think, trace it a little bit back to the Abe administration and his efforts. But I would argue that in general, the public is much more realistic than a lot of people give it credit for.
So you mentioned Shinzo Abe, and do you think that his assassination was something that galvanized the public in this particular regard?
I think it increased the despondency here. A lot of people, particularly those that I associate with, are very pessimistic about the future now. There's no leader or statesman who can fill Abe's shoes for probably quite a long time, maybe a whole generation. Whether that caused people to be more worried about the international situation, I don't know if there's a direct connection to that, but to become more pessimistic and worried about the future, I would think, that's very true.
I mean, so in terms of the public shift towards China, I'm kind of thinking back to like 2012. So, oh my gosh, that was 11 years ago. There were those anti-Japanese protests in China. And it seemed like the Chinese Communist Party was kind of, whether pushing them or not, certainly was allowing them to happen and allowing them to get rather severe in terms of burning down Japanese businesses and burning Japanese cars and products and that sort of thing. And there was certainly a tension point with Japan at the time. Is that sort of thing what concerns the Japanese public, or are they concerned about a much more serious matter when it comes to invasion, or was this Senkaku Islands or Taiwan? Like what is it for the Japanese public that is the most worrying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are a lot of things. So you mentioned 2012. That was the time of the so-called nationalization of the Senkaku Islands by the then administration, the Noda administration. And I've written about that in some detail last year in September, which was the 10th anniversary of that. I interviewed the then Prime Minister, Mr. Noda, about that time and the actions that he took, as well as some of the other players, at that time, the former governor of Tokyo, Ishihara Shintaro, and quite a few other folks from that period. So your viewers can Google my name, Robert D. Eldridge, and Senkaku's nationalization to see that story in more detail. But 2 years before that, in 2010, around the same time in September, there was the incident when the Chinese fishing vessel purposely crashed into the Japanese Coast Guard vessels. And the government at the time, the Japanese government at the time, released the captain after initially, holding him. And that generated a lot of frustration among the public that it was essentially caving into China. And then 2 years later, you had the outburst and the protests in China. Daily, Chinese authorities, in particular the Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard, send their ships into the waters around the Senkakus. Or they'll launch air intrusions into the air around Japan. So this past year, the number of intrusions was lower than in the past, but it's still in the multiple hundreds. There's frustration among the Japanese public about the amount of financial aid that was given to China throughout recent decades in the form of ODA, and that money was used not only to build up China, but also to essentially build up its economic capabilities, which would then overtake Japan's. There's frustration among Japanese public and Japanese businesses about being taken advantage of by Chinese government and Chinese businesses within China, and a feeling of unfairness in its relations with China. So there are a lot of factors that have been building or smoldering over the years that have gotten Japan to this point. And then Japanese will observe China's behavior towards its neighbors, as well as towards its minority populations within the country. And so there's an expression here in Japan that today's Hong Kong will be tomorrow's Taiwan and the day after's Okinawa. And so more and more people in Japan want to be able to stand up to China.
So the Japanese people think there's a real risk that China would actually invade and take over part of Japan, Okinawa.
If not the main islands of Japan, certainly the Nansei Islands, the southwestern islands, in other words, Okinawa, and obviously the Senkakus. So there is that concern about that. And China previously, as you know, has called the Senkakus their own, and they've also strongly hinted at Okinawa, being a part or having been a part of China. And so one of the fortunate things about China is that it declares what it's going to do. It tells the world what it's going to do. And so that's a clear warning, I think, to Japan that China, does intend to take the Senkakus, and it won't stop at the Senkakus. It'll continue on.
Well, this is very interesting because from what you're saying, China's benefited a lot from Japan, including direct investment. So what is China hoping to accomplish by harassing Japan by flying these jets into the region, making open threats about taking Japanese territory? What is their calculus?
Yeah, not being a Chinese government official, it's hard to know. But for example, with the Senkakus, there are 5 islands that make up the Senkakus. All of them could be militarized very easily, whether it's deploying missiles or radar. You can level one of the islands and make essentially a military air base out of it. You can deploy submarines there, if you wanted to. And that would basically neutralize that area. I think that U.S. forces would pull out of Okinawa if China were able to take the Senkakus, because for one reason, there'd be the potential for a clash or a conflict because they'd be located so closely. I think the U.S. would pull out at that juncture. I also think if China were to take the Senkakus, one of its intentions would be to drive a wedge in the U.S.-Japan alliance. The reason I say that is that I can see or envision a situation where the Japanese are possibly overly expecting the U.S. to come to Japan's aid if China were to take military action in the Senkakus, whereas the U.S. expects Japan to take the lead in any situation like that. So Japanese will expect the U.S. to do something. The U.S. will be expecting Japan to do something. In the meantime, China has created a fait accompli by easily invading the 5 islands and setting up shop there. It would be difficult to dislodge them. And then between U.S. and Japan, there would be a mutual blame game. And essentially a permanent wedge could be created in the U.S.-Japan alliance. So, the expression of killing, 2 birds with 1 stone, for China to do something in the Senkakus, it's killing multiple birds, by doing that. And then eventually, if the U.S. is driven from Asia, Japan's going to be very isolated. But stepping back a little bit, even before military invasion, I think one of China's other goals vis-a-vis Japan is basically to isolate and neutralize and weaken Japan's ability to influence things in the region and internationally. So essentially, I don't think China is willing to allow, a powerful Japan to continue to exist. It's got to be one or the other, and China, I think, is going to want to dominate. And that's why I think it goes out of its way to diminish Japan's influence in the region and in the world.
When you say that China could take the Senkakus, is this like a near-term possibility?
Before, after
before
Taiwan.
Yeah.
I personally was thinking it was, an either or, and then possibly a both. But more recently, particularly starting last summer, I've been warning of a scenario or situation in which China acted earlier than most commentators probably believe. Probably on your show and elsewhere, there's talk of a 2027 scenario. My view is that it's going to happen much earlier, that China will try to take Taiwan. And starting last summer, I was predicting between November last year and January of this year, in other words, now. And there are multiple reasons for that. And if you want, we can go into that later. But so in that case, Taiwan would happen more quickly, and possibly along those lines, the Senkakus. But if we're looking at it from a longer perspective, and if I were a Chinese government official, I would probably try to take the Senkakus first before moving on Taiwan. The reason being, what I mentioned earlier, that it can more easily drive a wedge in the U.S.-Japan alliance by taking the Senkakus, and then U.S. Forward deployment capabilities are potentially strongly weakened if it can't operate from Japan at that point. That makes taking Taiwan much easier for China. However, I think China may have other reasons to move more quickly on Taiwan, and it might do that first, or it might do Taiwan and Senkakus at the same time.
See, I feel like if China were to start taking over the Senkakus, the U.S. would see its military base in Okinawa as being more important and not less. I guess I just don't understand why the U.S. would pull out at a time of such great need.
Mm-hmm. There's, kind of a long history or background to the Senkakus issue, and I'm very critical of U.S. policy with regard to the Senkakus. And I wrote a book about it 8 or 9 years ago, essentially called The Origins of the Senkaku, problem. The title's a little bit longer, but until the reversion of Okinawa in 1972, the 77 years before that, from 1895, when the Senkakus became part of Japanese territory, the U.S. recognized Japan's sovereignty over the Senkakus. And then in 1971, when the Okinawa Reversion Agreement was being worked on, the U.S. started taking a sort of ambiguous, neutral stance on the Senkakus. The U.S. eventually returned the Senkakus along with Okinawa, but it returned administrative rights, but not sovereignty, so to speak. On the sovereignty issue, the U.S. took a neutrality stance saying that Taiwan, China, and Japan would need to work it out among themselves. And I find that a very irresponsible policy of the US, because it essentially created a vacuum in which, if the issue wasn't resolved quickly, perhaps China would eventually step into that. And that's what we've seen over the past 51 years. And that doesn't absolve Japan from part of the blame, too. Japan has done relatively nothing over the past 51 years to fill in that gap, to demonstrate that it has administrative rights over the islands. It hasn't built up the islands whatsoever like its other 450 inhabited islands. It didn't build a lighthouse. It didn't build a weather station. It didn't build a heliport or an airport. It didn't build a port for its fishing vessels, and it doesn't allow for government officials to be stationed on the island. And from an international perspective, I think that suggests that Japan doesn't have confidence with regard to its administration over the Senkaku Islands. So between Japan and the United States, there are differences about about the status of the Senkaku Islands. The recent 2+2 agreement between Japan and the United States, the U.S. recommitted itself to applying Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty over the Senkakus, but it didn't get at the root of the problem, which is the U.S. neutrality on the sovereignty of the islands. And so for a long time, I've called for the United States to go back to its 1972 position, which was that Japan has sovereignty over the islands. I think that would be the greatest way to deter China. Right now, it's ambiguous, and that really allows might to win over right in this situation. So I'm afraid that there will be a lot of mutual acrimony if China were to seize the islands between Japan and the United States over this issue. And then geographically, the Senkakus are very, very close to Okinawa. And the chance for a conflict to happen is very large. And I don't expect the U.S. to maintain a presence there if China were to seize the islands. In part because I think there would be frustration with Japan for not doing all it could to protect the Senkakus.
But do you think that means the U.S. would leave Japan? Like, would they move their military base somewhere else in the region, or would they just pull out?
Again, depending on the situation, I'm afraid that acrimony would be so strong that could lead not only to the pulling out from Okinawa, but possibly the dissolvement of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And the way it's written right now is that if one party wanted to end the treaty, it would inform the other party, and then 1 year later, the treaty would be dissolved. And that was part of the 1960 revised security treaty. So this is obviously a worst case situation, but I think it's highly likely. And in some cases, I think some people in Japan would possibly want to accommodate China at that point.
One of the things you mentioned when you were on our podcast last time, which was in 2021, you had said that on Okinawa, the island itself, there's sort of some activist groups that are very negative towards the U.S. presence there, and that it is possible that some of those groups are in fact encouraged by the Chinese Communist Party.
Mhm.
What's the status of that now?
Yeah, those groups, their size and their influence, fortunately, continue to decline as that older population, that anti-war, anti-base population, gets smaller. With that said, they get more and more vocal, and the media in Okinawa is extremely anti-government, anti-base, anti-war in its reporting. Today, for example, one of the two local newspapers in Okinawa took me to task in its newspaper for warning of an early Taiwan contingency, saying that that it's warmongering by identifying China as a threat to the region. So, and they invited another scholar whom I'm not familiar with, who said that there's no chance that China's going to invade Taiwan.
No chance. Not like in the near future, but just no chance at all.
No chance. The chance is very small, is how it was written.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So my sense is that the anti-base movement is getting smaller, but they're still very vocal because they have the media to amplify their message. And I would reiterate that they're not suffering financially, even though their numbers are, I think, getting smaller, in part because the Chinese consulate in Fukuoka, there's also a consulate in Naha, is able to funnel an obscene amount of money to these activists.
I mean, I guess to me it just seems like it's very clear that there is concern that China is going to invade Taiwan. They say it, whatever the scholar says. And, President Biden has repeatedly said he would defend Taiwan if China invaded. It seems strange to me that the idea that the U.S. would abandon Okinawa, one of the most important bases it has, to defend Taiwan. Because it seems like it's such a global concern now, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that an invasion of Taiwan will happen.
It seems very short-sighted.
Yeah, it seems impossible to me that they would knowingly be like that. I mean, that's essentially abandoning Taiwan too.
So you're saying the U.S. government, everything it does is incredibly intelligent and makes perfect sense?
Damn, we're dead.
No. So I'm not saying this is absolutely going to happen, but I'm worried about it. And I'm worried that the U.S. is creating some of the conditions to make something like this happen. With regard to the Senkakus, the U.S. needs to correct its mistaken, I call it flawed, Senkakus policy by clearing up the ambiguity that it created 52 years ago with the Okinawa Reversion Agreement. The previous 77 years, the U.S. was, correct in its policy that the islands belonged to Japan. And the Nixon-Kissinger administration in 1971, when it was negotiating the Okinawa Reversion Agreement, started to pull back from that. The Okinawa Reversion Agreement in June of 1971 was also being undertaken at the time that Kissinger was having his secret interactions with China to facilitate Nixon's eventual visit the following year in February. So as the White House is negotiating the Okinawa Reversion Agreement, it's also preparing for Nixon's visit and prior to that, Kissinger's visit to China. And so I believe that that the U.S. unfortunately was worried about China's claims to the Senkakus at that time, and left room for China to kind of play a role in this. So I understand that it wouldn't make sense for the U.S. to pull out, but I just think it's going to be, if the Senkakus are taken, and there's really no resistance, it's going to create a lot of friction in the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's going to create a lot of misunderstanding and friction within Japan, and a mutual blame game is going to set in. And I'm not sure what will happen at that point. I hope the U.S. doesn't pull out, but I can see that happening. And one of the reasons we're in this very desperate situation right now, where the U.S. is, I think, unilaterally weakening and worsening its presence, is if you go back to the 2003, 2004, 2005 discussions on the transformation of the U.S. military. At the time, the Bush administration, Rumsfeld, came up with the plan to pull back U.S. forces to Guam, to relocate Marines out of Okinawa to Guam. That was a unilateral decision. There was no serious request from the Japanese side. Later, the U.S. said, "Oh, let's make this look like it's a Japanese request." It was purely a U.S. move at that time. And so by pulling back or announcing that we're pulling back, we're essentially creating a vacuum in the area. And the recent 2+2 had to correct that and describe that it was, changing the structure of the Marine Division there, and that it wouldn't be going to Guam. So the U.S., I don't think, has a great record on doing things intelligently in the region.
Can you explain a little bit about the 2+2 agreement and what the significance of that is?
Yeah, so this recent 2+2 agreement seeks to, I think, strengthen Japan and U.S. coordination on a whole host of issues, from conventional warfare to cyber and space as well. In general, it's a pretty good agreement, I think, but on a couple of issues, several issues actually, I think it missed some good opportunities.
So before we get into that, like the two and the other two, like what is, for our viewers who haven't heard of 2+2, like what are those things?
Right. So 2+2 is essentially abbreviation for the foreign minister and defense minister of Japan and their U.S. counterparts. So U.S. Secretary of State and U.S. Secretary of Defense that would meet part of within the framework of the alliance, in this case the U.S.-Japan alliance, under the Security Consultative Committee, the SCC, and they would either update agreements or come up with the road ahead for strengthening the relationship between the two militaries. And it's not 100% limited to military matters. It'll include other matters as well, but it's generally diplomacy and military focused. And in this case, we're at a really key juncture where I think more than at any point in our histories, the two countries are seeing the region, quite similarly, if not identically. Whether it's the threat from North Korea, from China, and Russia as well. So I think the viewpoints are very, very aligned, but the thinking about what's needed to accomplish the goals, to me, didn't go far enough as it could have. So one example would be on shared use of U.S. facilities, U.S. bases in Japan. In mainland Japan, the main U.S. bases are shared use, joint use. But in Okinawa, which is probably where much of the fight is going to be, essentially the U.S. remains on U.S. bases and the Japanese remain on their bases. And so they're not living together, working together, or really training together as much as they could. And I often relate the U.S.-Japan alliance as sort of a marriage. A marriage, I think, is strongest when the husband and wife are living together and not living separately. So they talk about increasing joint use, but they don't provide any really strong or clear messages in that regard.
It sounds like the U.S. and Japan need some marriage counseling.
Or some hand-holding, I think. I've been calling for shared use, joint use for more than 2 decades and have published commentaries from the early 2000s on that. It's taken a long, long time to get to this point, but there's still a long ways to go. Within the U.S. Marine Corps and Navy, there's a organization, a structure called a MU, Marine Expeditionary Unit. And it's generally comprised of about 3 ships with about 2,000, 2,200 Marines. For a long time, I and other former Marine officials have been calling for a multilateral MU in which other countries can contribute, ship and personnel and create MUs that would operate in the region. Unfortunately, this 2+2 doesn't call for that. The U.S. only has 1 MU in the Indo-Pacific region. We have 6 back in the Western Hemisphere, 3 on the West Coast, 3 on the East Coast. But we only have 1 in this region. And as you know, this region is 52% of the Earth's surface. So 1 MU can't do all that. And you need at least 3 MUs to be able to operate efficiently, because when 1 MU is out to sea, the next MU is getting ready, is getting trained, and the one that just finished its deployment is, getting checked, and the personnel are, taking vacations, doing everything they need to do. So it's a continuous rotation. We don't have that in the Indo-Pacific. So our presence is very, weak and limited, I think, and not as robust as it could be. So the 2+2, in my opinion, should have called on Japan to submit or to supply ships and personnel, just like the Quad and maybe AUKUS should do as well. So it's very easy now to create a multilateral MU, and so I think we missed that opportunity. I mentioned before the Senkakus. The U.S. reaffirmed its commitment to defend the Senkakus under Article 5. To me, though, every time that U.S. leaders and Japanese leaders meet, and you may have seen this in previous interactions, and most recently when Kishida met with Biden, that was reaffirmed again. It's very odd that 2 allies need to reaffirm something that is well understood. And in 1971, in the Senate, at the time of the ratification and the deliberations on the Okinawa Reversion Agreement, the Senkakus, fall under Article 5. That was clear. That was made clear by a State Department official in the Senate. And yet, Japan has to ask each time there's a senior meeting for the U.S. to reaffirm that. If you're watching that from the outside, you tend to wonder just how solid the U.S.-Japan relationship is when the two countries, or particularly the U.S., needs to reaffirm that it's committed to defending the Senkakus under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. If you were a company president and you're meeting with another company president, you don't show the contract with that company each time and ask him or her, is this contract still valid? Yet Japan's leaders want to do that each time with the U.S. So my point is that the U.S., by not fully committing to respect Japan's sovereignty over the islands, causes a lot of confusion within Japanese policymaking circles, among the public, and it sends a very bad message to China and to the international community.
It kind of reminds me of what's happening with Taiwan and, the fact that the whole strategic ambiguity thing that the US has had as policy for many years is just creating a lot of uncertainty and confusion.
And it's gotten kind of weird too, because every time someone asks President Biden, like, will the U.S. defend Taiwan? He's like, yes, we will. And then the White House is like, what? We're just saying we're not changing the status quo, right? It's a pretty weird walk back. I mean, are we seeing that also with Japan, or is it different, like weird in a different way?
To me, it's just weird that this discussion has to be held in the first place. It got weird in the mid-1990s. The Clinton administration and the embassy in Tokyo at the time kind of muffed up the understanding of the obligations towards the Senkakus at that time. And that caused a lot of panic in Japan about what the U.S. was going to do. And, if you remember, a lot of the same players that we have now in the Biden administration were active in the Clinton administration at that time. So they fumbled badly, and they caused Japan to have some serious concerns about U.S. intentions. So since the mid-1990s, specifically 1996, Japan has felt a need almost continuously to make sure the U.S. is really committed to defending the Senkakus. Let's see, another issue that came up in the 2+2, which was important, but left me with a couple of questions, was that within Japan, there's a real concern about the application of the nuclear umbrella vis-a-vis Japan, in part because of Russia's statements about intending to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So many Japanese felt that that Biden didn't do enough to stand up to Russia at that time. And so they wonder if there's a similar move in East Asia, whether the Biden administration will truly defend Japan. So at this time in the 2+2, the U.S. made clear that the defense of Japan included nuclear weapons. And the U.S. really doesn't talk about that too much. And one of the first times it did, but you don't see it in writing too much, is back in the mid-1960s. In 1965, the Japanese prime minister at the time, who was Abe's great uncle, his name was Sato Eisaku, he met with President Johnson. And this was right after the Chinese tests in 1964 the fall of 1964, the nuclear tests. And Japan was very worried about what China would do with nuclear weapons. And Johnson told Sato, and you can find these in the online memorandum of conversation, that as long as he was president, that the U.S. would defend Japan, with nuclear weapons. But to me, I think the key phrase was, as long as I'm president. And afterwards, it wasn't really spelled out or clearly written out too much. So within Japan, there's been some concern. And then if you remember, in the summer of 2021, July of 2021, China, or a video was made within China that suggested if Japan were to become involved in a Taiwan contingency, that China would wreak havoc on Japan greater than Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That the no first use policy did not apply to Japan. So there's been, at least for the past year and a half, there have been rumblings in Japan about whether the U.S. would actually use nuclear weapons to defend Japan. So in the 2+2, that was specifically mentioned. And my question becomes, was that included to neutralize those rumblings, like preemptively neutralize those rumblings, to address those rumblings, or was it preemptive to eliminate discussion within Japan about developing its own nuclear capability? And so I'm not sure on the Japanese side, why that came up. Was the Japanese government addressing genuine concerns that exist in Japan, or were they using those concerns and then getting the U.S. to acknowledge that the nuclear umbrella implied to remove the necessity to have any discussions about Japan becoming nuclear? So I'm not sure, what was happening at that time within the Japanese government. But those are some questions I have, about the 2+2.
In general, do you think the 2+2 is moving in the right direction?
I do. I just think it's too slow. Some of the things that it's discussing, it could have done a long, long time ago. Plus, it doesn't go far enough. It's little. I don't want to say too little, but it's little and it's late.
Do you think that recently Prime Minister Kishida made kind of a world tour, visited Biden. He also visited France, Italy, the UK, Canada. Do you think the analysis on his part is that growing concerns about China as well as questions about the U.S. alliance?
Let's see. I think he's continuing a trend for Japan to develop more robust relations with a number of countries and to expand the contents of those relationships to include security matters. So I think that's a very healthy trend because it causes Japan to be more engaged in the international security arena. Plus, it's also a way to gain support for Japan's security in general, plus its new initiatives. So I applaud those efforts of Japan to expand its security relations with other countries. It's very, very necessary, I think. I think the main purpose of his trip was to get understanding of the recent security documents that were released. and to get the buy-in of those other countries that Japan's not pursuing a hostile militaristic path, but it's a natural progression of its role and responsibilities. And I also think it was to develop support for the agenda of the G7 meeting that's going to be held this summer in Hiroshima, where Kishida is originally from. And so he wants to make this G7 summit a huge success. So his going at this time will help them develop the agenda for those meetings. So I think it was a well-timed visit, and I think that it went off pretty well for him.
But so if he's meeting with the G7 countries ahead of time, he skipped Germany, though.
Yeah, there's been some commentary on that, and I'm not sure exactly of all the reasons behind that, but there has been commentary on that, and I'm not sure if it's in the context of Russia and Ukraine, or if there's another reason behind that.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I guess since we kind of touched on this before, I'm just curious your thoughts. Do you think Japan should have nukes?
For a long time, I was against that. And the reason being that Japan, having experienced, two atomic bombings, that it had a unique voice in international affairs, that it should try to hold on to that special position as long as possible. That and it's not an appropriate phrase to use, but it had a card internationally that it could use, a voice that it could speak out on nuclear issues in a way that probably no other country could. So I didn't want to see Japan surrender that. With that said, though, over the past 7-8 years, I think a lot of things have changed. So back in 2015, when Trump was exploring running for president, if you remember, he made comments to the effect that that it would be fine if Japan were to develop nuclear weapons. Within Japan, among a number of politicians and commentators, there have been, and an increasing number of them, there have been comments along the lines that that Japan should end its non-nuclear principles and allow for either nuclear weapon sharing or the U.S. to redeploy nuclear weapons back into Japan. So until 1960, we had nuclear weapons in mainland Japan. And then the revised security treaty necessitated something called the prior consultation clause, where if there were changes in equipment and armaments, that we would notify the Japanese government, and hopefully they would give their blessing. But we could take nuclear weapons out of Japan in the 1950s, 1960, because we had free use in Okinawa. And so we basically were able to operate nuclear weapons from Okinawa. But so within Japan, there's been an argument for a number of years now that either nuclear sharing or allowing the U.S. to redeploy nuclear weapons into Japan. In 2017, I attended a conference, and a former Indian senior official attended, and he made the argument that in light of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that it's irresponsible for a democracy and a country that honors and respects civilian control like Japan does, not to have nuclear weapons. So in other words, if there's going to be proliferation, it's better to have a a responsible country have them rather than irresponsible countries to have them. So that was also another argument that kind of pushed me along the lines that, yeah, it would be interesting for Japan to entertain that. So personally, I think Japan should be to conduct the research necessary to do it, but without necessarily actually producing them right now. So should go to as far as it can on the research and research side, and whether it shifts to development and production could come at a future point. But in between that and the situation we have right now could be nuclear sharing or U.S. redeploying nuclear weapons into Japan.
So you mentioned that you were at a meeting with a senior Indian official related to Japan affairs, and I guess this is a point I want to ask about India, because India and Japan are also kind of warming relations militarily, right? And what's going on there, and what does that have to do with China?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Japan and India have actually always had very, very close relations. And I think they were greatly solidified by the late Prime Minister Abe, both during his first term in 2006, 2007, as well as in over the past decade. Both being naval powers, both essentially bordering China. They make natural allies, in that regard. Shared values, democracy, rule of law. But as we know, India is essentially non-aligned power and doesn't want to have alliance relations, with any country. You would think, based on its relations with China, that it would be a natural ally, but unfortunately, it's got its own views with regard to that. Japan's been able to facilitate, I think, India's activities with the U.S. and with Australia better than those two countries could do vis-a-vis India on its own. So I think for the Quad to have come together, it really needed Japan to be that facilitator. So the evolution of that relationship, we're seeing now with the Indian Air Force training with the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, as well as other interactions as well. So I think it's a natural progression. It'll probably take place or go as fast as India wants it to go. In the past, it would have been things can only move as fast as Japan wants it to go. But now Japan is, I think, fully on board with moving relationships forward as quickly as they can go. So in the Indo-Japanese realm, I think the relationship is going to, how fast it goes is going to be more India dependent than Japan dependent.
Is it a problem that India has mainly relied on Russian military technology and Japan has mainly relied on U.S. technology?
If we're talking about a full-blown alliance relationship, yeah, I think that would be a significant problem. But I'm not sure just how far India is willing to go in integrating itself with, with the other Quad members, or with AUKUS in the future, or whatever regional framework, evolves in the future. I don't think it's a huge problem for, Japan and the U.S. per se. I think it's a bigger problem for India in that sense. But India's got a very unique relationship with Russia. The Soviet Union, Russia, in the United Nations has essentially always voted in India's favor on issues, particularly vis-a-vis Pakistan. And so India is very indebted to Russia over those matters. The acquisition of Russian, weapons and equipment, and to a certain extent doctrine, very dependent on Russia. And then also Russian oil, it's very dependent. So India's in a very unique position, as you know. So,
Well, I guess as we start to wrap up today, I'm just curious, in a worst case scenario, what's at stake for Japan if China takes Senkaku, takes Okinawa, and takes Taiwan? How will that change the region?
I think, in order, Okinawa would be the last one. I think the more immediate threat now is Taiwan, the seizure of Taiwan. And if China were to take Taiwan, that to me changes the international politics for generations to come. I think it will push the United States out of Asia. It will weaken U.S. prestige in the region. It will force countries to recalculate and probably realign themselves with China, to include potentially Japan, the Philippines, obviously, other countries, Vietnam and other countries in the region. By the PLA getting redeployed to Taiwan, it will greatly disrupt Japan's trade and its ability to export and import. Almost everything goes by Taiwan. And so if it's in Chinese hands, Japan will have to essentially pay China for anything it does after that. And then that will have enormous impact within Japan, politically and economically, and it will make Japan subservient to China, I think. So the implications are huge for everybody. And then, if the scenario is that the Senkakus are taken simultaneously, that further weakens Japan. And then it makes a matter of time before Okinawa is taken. And then China will say, don't worry, we're stopping here. And then a couple years later, it'll ask for Kyushu and then other parts as well. So I just think it's immense. And that's why the need to protect Taiwan is enormous, because if Taiwan's lost, then everything's lost. But I may be in the minority, but I think that it'll be very, very difficult to protect Taiwan militarily. Therefore, within Japan, and today I gave a lecture before a defense group, I strongly call on Japan, the United States, and other nations to recognize Taiwan as a country, as it is.
Well, you can't use the C word.
I'm sorry. Yeah, exactly.
The C word. Yeah. It's a dangerous word to use.
Yeah. Well, in Japan, there are two phrases that are used: kuni or koka, and some people are hesitant to use it, but I use both of them, particularly koka, on a daily basis when talking about Taiwan. The reason for this is, as you know, 14 countries right now, 13 of which are in the United Nations, recognize Taiwan, but all of them are small, have basically no military power. However, if not 13 or 14, but 130, 140 countries were to recognize Taiwan, I believe China would have to reconsider any actions on Taiwan. To me, that's the only true deterrence that's possible at this point. And so I would like to see all the nations of the world, or as many as possible, to recognize Taiwan. Because without that, it's going to be a very, very tough fight, I think.
You mentioned this a little earlier, but why do you think that the invasion of Taiwan could be essentially almost now?
Right. So, I think most experts agree that China has a military advantage, strategic advantage over Taiwan right now, particularly vis-a-vis the United States forces in the region. Some experts have said that since as early as 2015, Taiwan could or China could easily seize Taiwan. And I think those abilities have only grown in recent years. Related to the strategic dynamics, China's developed capabilities to take out satellites, and without satellites, it's very difficult to wage a modern war, whether it's GPS or telecommunications. And the ability to defend those satellites aren't in place right now. And I think that's what was behind Admiral Davidson's comments back in March of 2021 that China could act as early as 6 years, from now, because it was to be 6 years hence before the systems were in place to defend the satellites against Chinese attacks. Another strategic dynamic or element that is prevalent right now is the U.S. sharing of weapons with Ukraine, and as a result, our weaponry has been depleted, and that puts China at a great advantage if it were to do something, and if a conflict were prolonged, that the U.S. wouldn't have everything it needs to be able to share with Taiwan or defend Taiwan. So just in the strategic realm right there, I think China's at a huge advantage. Internationally speaking, Taiwan is isolated, unfortunately. And, using a comparison with Ukraine, I think the two reasons Ukraine is able to fight, as long as it's been doing is geographically related as well as internationally related. Internationally, it's recognized, by essentially all countries, as a nation, and therefore, from an international point of view or a legal point of view, it's able to accept that aid, and then geographically, it's surrounded by 8 countries, 6 of which its people can flee to if necessary, or it can get aid from. Whereas Taiwan, being an island, if China were to conduct a surround the island, it would be hard for people to evacuate, and it would be hard to resupply, Taiwan. So it's very, dangerous in that perspective. International attention toward Taiwan is growing, and particularly, around the time of Pelosi's visit, I think China will act before that international attention takes some form. So, for example, before Taiwan is officially invited into some international organization, or before Taiwan is invited to a multilateral military exercise, China will want to take action. We talked about Japan's new strategic documents, and also the fact that Japan is going to increase its budget, essentially double its the proportion of its GDP towards the military over the next 5 years. Before those policies come into play, I can see China wanted to take action rather than waiting until Japan has a greatly increased budget, more equipment, more personnel. Similarly, I can see China taking action before Japan creates its own Taiwan Relations Act. And there's discussions about that within Japan now. And if you look at Japan, Taiwan, and the U.S. as a triangle, the U.S. has that relationship, the alliance with Japan, and the U.S. has the Taiwan Relations Act, but there's nothing between Japan and Taiwan. So Japan has no ability, legal authority to help or engage Taiwan. And so it's kind of like a ladder that doesn't have anything strengthening between it. So it could collapse very easily. Prime Minister Abe, before he died, in his article in April 2022, that I think was published in the States as well, in Los Angeles Times maybe, he talked about Taiwan's ambiguous situation, and he called on the U.S., the Biden administration, to end the strategic ambiguity. But he also added that Taiwan doesn't have any international legal status. And so basically it's a domestic issue of China right now. So the international community doesn't really have any way to support Taiwan. And he didn't go as far as to say that, the international community should recognize Taiwan. I wish he did that in his article. He didn't go that far in saying it, but that's something that I think we all should do. So until that happens, I think it's going to be very, 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 very difficult to easily defend Taiwan. And that makes it more likely that China will act. I think the window, though, is short for China, or narrow for China. President Trump announced in November, December that he was thinking of running again in 2024. I think that's probably one calculus in China's views about when it's going to act. It probably would want to do it while Biden's still in office rather than a Trump administration. So to me, that means that China may act more quickly rather than later. And then there have been other things out there too.
Well, it seems like the next couple of years are going to be they're going to be in the history books, I think, one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully not written in Mandarin and approved by the Chinese state. Well, thank you again for joining us. It's amazing to see just how much is on the line and how it's kind of gotten to this point by many decades of bad decisions.
Exactly.
Then again, according to a scholar, you are just a warmonger. So, I mean, just because China says they're going to make, what was it, Nagasaki and Hiroshima seem like nothing when they attack. Don't call them out on that.
Right.
You're the problem, not China.
Right. And then if I could also do a plug for a book that some other warmongering friends of mine we put out last summer. We published it in Japan. It's called Chugoku no Kyoi ni Muketa Shin Nichibei Domei. So a new U.S.-Japan alliance to deal with the Chinese threat or the China threat. And some of the chapter contributors have probably been on China Uncensored before. Professor Carrie Gershanik, political warfare specialist. Captain James Fennell from the U.S. Navy, the intelligence specialist, and very concerned about China's naval might. Bill Gertz from Washington Times on Chinese economic and military activities, particularly in space. And then Colonel Grant Newsham from the U.S. Marine Corps, who is constantly pushing Japan to up its game, particularly with the self-defense forces.
We've had most of them on our show, so this is like the Avengers movie of books.
Yeah. All of these fine folks have been my mentors over the years with military and security matters. But unfortunately, there's not an English version. It's only in Japanese. But this was really meant for a Japanese audience. And we end with a lot of recommendations about the alliance, that some of which I alluded to before, that the 2+2 didn't address. But fortunately, some of our recommendations were found in the 2+2. So it wasn't entirely a bad thing. So
Great. Well, yeah, we'll definitely put a link to that in the description below for any of our audience who speaks Japanese or is in Japan. And I think, regardless of what anyone thinks, I think we can all agree that at the end of the day, we really need to make Taiwan our waifu. Thank you for joining.
I totally agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really, I'm thinking like his idea about the Senkakus in Okinawa, like that makes a lot of sense to me because like if China were to invade Taiwan, it has the issue that the U.S. would probably get involved, and the U.S. has a base in Okinawa. So if China invades Taiwan, that means it's going to be fighting the U.S. and it's going to have to be fighting Japan because it will have to attack that U.S. base in Okinawa. But if ahead of that invasion of Taiwan, you get the U.S. and Japan to be at odds with each other and get the U.S. to withdraw from Okinawa, then they can invade Taiwan without that being an issue. And even if the U.S. does come, they will be in a weaker position and they don't necessarily have to attack Japan. It limits the number of fronts in the war.
I hope this podcast doesn't give the CCP any ideas.
I mean, it definitely made me rethink the importance of the Senkakus, which I hadn't really thought about in almost a decade in some ways.
Yeah, I just thought it was Senkaka. Waiting 12 years for that.
And this is why you watch our show. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that's why Chris Chappell ruins the Japan-U.S. alliance. But I think it is interesting how the U.S. has a similar problem with the Senkakus that it does with Taiwan, and that it won't say that Japan has sovereignty or it won't say that Taiwan is a country because it seems maybe it's worried that it would somehow like aggravate China or like
or anger China.
Yeah, basically.
I can see the headlines now.
Angering China. Yeah, so then you have this timidity that in Dr. Eldridge's opinion, would actually cause these the authoritarian country of China to like have more of an ability to take over.
Yeah, ambiguity with authoritarians is not the best policy.
I mean, I kind of like the idea. I'm imagining like all of a sudden 130 countries are like, yeah, we recognize Taiwan as a country, and
or waifu.
And if the PRC doesn't like it, they don't have to keep relations with us.
Yeah. Okay. What movie is this that you're watching?
Because this is the movie that I produce. It's not going to be a good movie, but
it will all be starred. Every character will be played by Mechanism.
Maybe I can get Tommy Wiseau to direct my movie.
Okay, this is going off the rails now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it'll be very interesting to see how all this plays out because there are also so many other factors going on. Like, we didn't talk about it, but, there's the COVID spike in China. Who knows how many people are dying in China, how that might affect things.
Probably in the millions, at least.
Easily.
Yeah.
So the question is, will an authoritarian regime that sees its population in decline and its economy in deep decline, is that going to make an authoritarian country be more aggressive? And there is some historical evidence that, yeah, when authoritarians see their weakening power, going to war seems like a great idea, actually.
You mean historical references like last February?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's history.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, I mean, gosh. Yeah. This is one of those podcasts that made me worry more about the fate of the world in the future. Isn't that almost every podcast?
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for watching Existential Crisis Unleashed. What's the point? Nothing matters.
Yeah. See you guys later.
Bye.